Um, Selgu iros Caitacos.
Mm-hmm.
That's my attempt at any rate. You'll correct me. Has been a
No,
Gaulish polytheist. Is it close at least?
it's close. There's rolling of the R's, so it's like a brief
Oh,
rolling.
I'm
So it'd be
terrible at those.
a lot of people are.
I figured that the G was fairly weak.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. Selgu iros Caitacos has been a Gaulish polytheist for more than 9 years. He's been involved in the Tuta Galatian organization since its inception and is the founder of Matalon Bulgan, previously known as Cenobesis Bulgan. Selgu iros pursued a photography degree until joining the Minnesota National Guard, honorably discharged after 6 years of obligatory service. Now he is employed in the food service industry, feeding his entire neighborhood most of the week. Besides making iconography in an eldritch apotropaic style, he enjoys martial arts history and physical training as a spiritual practice. He still resides on Anishinabeg and Ocheti Chakawiye land, hoping that their indigenous cultures and languages will see a great revival before he dies. And let me second that wish, certainly.
All right, so my paper is titled The Irreducibility of Gaulish Polytheisms, Both Ancient and Revived. So to start, I want to read a quote from Julius Caesar. I'm not going to read the Latin version because my Latin is absolutely bad, but it breaks down as they worship their divinity, Mercurius in particular, and have many images of him, and regard him as the inventor of all arts. They consider him the guide of their journeys and marches and believe him to have great influence over the acquisition of gain and mercantile transactions. Next to him, they worship Apollo and Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva. So from the snippet of Caesar's commentary, we see an attempt at explaining religious leanings of the continental Celts. At first, the reader is tempted to take Caesar at his word, since he had been in a campaign dedicated to conquering the Gauls in their homelands. And it's much easier to expect an accurate telling from someone who's been on site, after all. But when examining the motive of Caesar's campaign and whom he borrows from, Posidonius of Apamea, another ethnographer who traveled Gallia, we have to question, can we trust this to be Caesar's attempt at continuity, or are some of these commentaries a way to fill gaps of understanding quickly in order to bypass the questions of motive? Basically, is this all propaganda to, make a monolith? And we see a possible number of 400 inscriptions referencing Mercurius in both Roman Gaul and Britain. Actually, if we do include Britain, that raises the number to 600. So we can see a grain of truth in Caesar's and possibly Posidonius' account. But keep in mind that these inscriptions occur in the Gallo-Roman era. Should we assume that Caesar was using interpretatio Romana, a way of explaining foreign religious figures to a Roman audience without an exhaustive, in-depth examination? Or is this an example of interpretatio indigena, in which the indigenous Celtic speaking peoples with enough knowledge of Greek and Roman religions related their local gods to a foreign audience? To summarize this phenomenon, who are the ones translating these gods and for whom? Which has the ultimate agency in this discussion? Which gods are which? Is there a sameness or merely a similarity? This is an issue that Gaulish polytheistic religions faces regularly within the examination of all inscribed deoi or gods, not just the ones syncretized to Mercurius or Mercurius-like gods. Even without the inscriptions of Roman theonyms attached syncretically to Celtic theonyms, depictions of indigenous gods in the Roman era carry artful Roman imagery, which then confuses the line between who is who and what is what. So we have an example of this as well, the burned Scalia. These are later notes inside of Lucanus' Pharsalia, and they give the different prescriptive actions within Gaulish cult. So we have Tyrannus Dispater is appeased by them in the following fashion. In a wicker of wood, a certain number of men are burned. So there's obviously the wicker man that Kaiser talks about, but also later mentioned by Lucanus, which we've never found archaeologically. But then it also goes over for Jupiter Tyrannus, the master of wars and the greatest of gods of the sky, accustomed formerly to being appeased by human heads, today is honored by the head of beasts. So right off the bat, we have different prescriptive actions and different interpretatios for Tyrannus. We also have Essus Mars was then placated. A man was hanged in a tree until his arms and legs would gorily fall off. And then among the Gauls, Tutatis Mercurius is appeased in this way. A man is put with his head in a full tub, and here he suffocates. And even more within the Pharsalia and burned. So we also have Essus Mars is appeased in this manner. They hang a man from a tree until his members fall off. Oh, and for whatever reason, my internet connection is unstable. That's weird.
Yeah. We lost about 10 seconds of you.
You
should be okay now, though.
Okay.
Let's just go back a little bit.
For sure. So let's see here. But yeah, within the Pharsalian
Gods are getting excited. That kind of thing happens.
It's very true. But yeah, within the Pharsalia and Burned Scalia, there are different interpretatios. Let's see, where are they? Essus Mars is appeased in this manner. They hang a man from a tree until his members fall off from the loss of blood, versus they think that Essos is Mercury, although he is honored by the merchants and as a war leader and great god of the heavens. They have Tyrannus Jupiter, who was once appeased by human heads, but is now content with herds. So even within the notes of one writing, they kind of give it away right there. It's either, well, is Essus Mars, or is he Mercurius? Is Tyrannus Jupiter, or is he Dispater? So let's see, where did I lose my place? So is there a mistake by all parties involved, or has the answer been in front of us the entire time? By ironically attempting to translate Gaulish religion into monolithic understanding, ethnographers like Lucanus and Kaiser will show us the possibility overlooked by Celticists and other scholars, that indigenous Gaulish religion was never monolithic, but a plurality of local religions that could intertwine at any given time. And even without the help of ethnographers, we still have epigraphic examples of localized cults, which demonstrate the plurality of both Gaulish religio cultures and the gods themselves. So in Gallia Lugdunensis, we have Dumnocarantiacus Mercurius, we have Apollo Dumnocarantiacus, and Prasmerta Dumnocarantiacus. And this is a place name, and it's also found in the genitive. So this place name basically shows that this is Mercury of Dumnocarantiacum, and so on and so on. So these are different versions of these major gods. And then we also have one of the more famous Gaulish gods, Karnonos, which this might surprise a few people, but there's actually a genitive of Karnonos in a protoform demonstrated by Del Mar in an inscription. But the English is Elentinos dedicated this to Karnonos of Elasontea. So that's a Karnonos of Alicentea, a specific god located in a specific place. And Patrizia de Bernardo Stempel, in her paper, Theonymic Gender and Number Variation as a Characteristic of Old Celtic Religion, points to an elusive inscription dedicated to a carnane, a Latinized female plural form of carnanos. And this is all on top of the numerous matrone and matres cults in Gallia or Celtica through epigraphy. So while there are cults that migrated and were imported, we don't see a universal Celtic or Gaulish religion, but a plurality of religio cultures that could interlink on the fly with other religio cultures. Let's see here. Oh, and we also have examples of different interceding religious figures between Celtic cultures demonstrated by Aristotle through Diogenes. So that quote right here is, some say that the study of philosophy originated with the barbarians. In that among the Persians, there existed the Magi, and among Babylonians and or Assyrians, the Chaldei. Among the Indians, the Gymnosophistae, and among the Celts and Galatai, men who are called Druids and Semnotheae, as Aristotle relates in his book on magic and Stotion in the 23rd of his succession of philosophers. And it's interesting to note that he differentiates the Galatai and Celts. So the Galatians right here are said to have Semnotheae instead of the Druids. And the idea of the Gauls being a noble savage culture worshiping exclusively in open air nemeta, which is the plural form nemeton, become challenged as well when we look to Britannia and find shrines dated to the late pre-Roman Iron Age in Heathrow, Middlesex. While this example is not conclusive, it's really hard to imagine that there was no such thing as pre-Gaulish temples that had not been appropriated and rebuilt post-conquest. We also see a contrast between Diodorus and Lucanus' accounts in terms of Gaulish iconography. The former relates a story of Brennus, leader of the Prausi, laughing at wooden and stone anthropomorphic iconography at Delphi. Brennus, king of the Gauls, on entering a temple, found no dedications of gold or silver, and when he came only upon images of stone and wood, he laughed at them. To think that men, believing that gods have human form, should set up their images in wood and stone. And Diodorus may have been trying to set up a narrative for propaganda here to demonstrate a notion that the Gauls were so savage that they believed that gods could not take human form. And Kaiser kind of demonstrates a similar statement on how the Germani had no druids and worshiped the sun and moon. The later, however, describes a nemeton with roughly hewn effigies of gods made of wood. No sylvan nymphs found here found a home, nor Pan, but savage rites and barbarous worship. Altars horrible on massive stones upheared. Sacred with blood of men was every tree. Effigies of gods, rude, scarcely fashioned from some fallen trunk, held the mid-space, and pallid with decay, their rotting shapes struck terror. And again, this might be an example of propaganda and xenophobia. But it does show that there are two different approaches regarding iconography throughout space and time. With more archaeological discoveries regarding epigraphy and Celtic linguistics, we're finding more and more that the idea of an ancient and unchanging Celtic, monolithic Celtic Gaulish religio culture is a fantasy. But this fantasy has spawned inspiration to revive religious beliefs of the continental Celtic speaking peoples. One of the first and more well-known organization of a pan-Gaulish religion, Tota Galatian, was founded by Segamaros Witigeni. This organization is an umbrella group which Tegas Lugoi, house crowds or hearths, can formally interact with each other whilst voting democratically on matters involving the Tota, or people. It has its own holidays based on the Coligny calendar, and some which are also inspired by certain insular Celtic holidays. This organization is meant to be a generalized Gaulish hub and demonstrates in its name, which means people of the Galatis. Galatis being the original term that spawned the term Gaul. And Kim McCone has a paper on the history of that. It's really good. The term Galatis has since been adopted as a generalized term for Gaulish polytheists, similar to heathen for Germanic polytheism. Besides giving a starting identity to the up-and-coming Gaulish polytheists, Tota Galatian, TG for short, has also given birth to other traditions within a Gaulish religious scope through inspiration. It should also be mentioned before we move on that the contemporary Gaulish polytheism community has been heavily linked to the use of Gaulish language, which, seems pretty self-explanatory. Many of these traditions include the word besos, custom, another defining Gaulish word in the genitive case, custom of, and other defining Gaulish words in the genitive case, spelling errors, where others have taken to not naming their way so verbosely. Besides naming their traditions, the founders have also named themselves to gain a connection to the ancient continental Celts, regardless of the broken continuum. See myself as an example. There is Bessus. Oh man, there's so many syllables. Bessus Nua Galatium, BNG, a tradition birthed by TG, looked to be more inspired as a religio culture rather than be restricted completely by historical precedents. This gave way to the needs of the community by setting up codified rituals and understandings of theological concepts for Galatis that didn't necessarily wish to branch out into a focus of a specific Gaulish region in time, but weren't necessarily adverse to it. Or perhaps wanted a newer pan-Gaulish communal outlook. We also have the Carnutian Nemeton, which is a blog done by Vanos Carnuto Druidan. And he has an explicit focus on his literal patron god, Galbanos, the smith, since he is a blacksmith. And he also reconstructs anything related to the Druidists and anything relating to his namesake, the Carnutes. Another tradition linked to TG is Nemeton Elwetian, headed by Artokatos Tauranikos. This tradition aims to look towards the Elweti, people famous for being the first Gallic tribe confronted by Caesar in his campaign for reconstruction and inspiration. There are also numerous syncretism attempts, the most famous in the Gaulish polytheism community being Deo Mercurio, a Gallo-Roman religious tradition founded by Woodicus Brigantici. This tradition has been met with hesitation over the years as Gaulish romanticism has caused prejudice towards Roman religion. And while the Romans certainly had a huge hand in colonialism, Woodicus maintains that tribal identity was codified by the Gauls by use of the Roman governing system. So this tradition is incredibly important because it demonstrates that while colonialism happened within the Celtic-speaking tribes, they ultimately had agency and tenacity within their own respective religio cultures during the Romanized era. And of course, there's the almost uncategorizable religio cultures related to the Gaulish language, such as my tradition, Mantalan Bolga. This tradition is inspired by the Belgae and their martial demeanor. And a point of differentiation between MB, for short, and others is that we have taken its de-Latinized form Volkoi as an identifier rather than Galatis. Reasons for this include Caesar's claims that the Belgae were different from the Galli, different language, different customs, to paraphrase him, but then mentioned them as the bravest of the Gauls. So a little bit of a contradiction right there. Adding to the confusion, some Belgic tribes claim to be Germanic in descent, but it's more than likely that it's a reference to location in regards to the Rhine rather than a linguistic Teutonic affiliation. While starting in the Gaulish language, Mental and Bulgan has integrated Proto-Germanic, but also Latin for a total of 3 official liturgical languages. This concept is a conceptual design feature in the religio culture to remind the initiated that tribal affiliation didn't stop when everyone became Roman. It's in this way we're not the language we identify, instead we become Belgic. Because of this feature, Mental and Bulgan has spawned more interesting syncretisms such as Franco-Belgic and Belgo-Gothic religio cultures in its umbrella. We have seen that there's no effective way to reduce any of these religions down in both the ancient and contemporary. Images of a noble Celtic savage still run through the head of anyone who listens to a certain folk metal band. But the varied people among the continental Celts show that's not all about Roman hatred or nationalism. Plurality existed amongst the Gaulish speakers while maintaining material and linguistic links to each other, religiously or otherwise. And that's my conclusion.
All right. Since we have some extra time, would you like to show that video that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Here, let me.
Yeah. Just bring it up and share your screen because I think that people will find this very interesting.
All right, give me 1 second.
Sure. And we're very fortunate to have in attendance a fellow Celticist who I hope will have some interesting questions for you.
Yeah.
All right, so you can introduce this a little bit if you want.
For sure. So this is actually what I would consider a theophany. This happened right after I was healing from my tattoo sleeve. And so it's a very profound vision that I had. It woke me up at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I remember it very vividly. But I had to change a few things to contextualize it. I made it more so as if it were an ancient tale. So, I mean, you know, the National Guard clearly doesn't use spears, but it's, you know, essentially it's me. So, all right, and here we go.
Yeah, it's a shame that we didn't get the sound with that. I
Okay,
think we've had to something with the settings. I'm not sure, but at any rate, I wanted people to be able to experience that, and people can of course look it up on TikTok.
for sure.
Yeah. Um,
I should have
let me
warned everyone too, like it's all in Gaulish, so it might have been
Yeah,
a
but
little hard to read. And
it's such a beautiful, yeah, I mean, well, and I mean, the translation is there. And in the original video, hearing the spoken Gaulish is beautiful. And so I highly recommend it to people. Um, what I would, let me see, do we still, yes. If P. Siphanus Virius Lupus is not indisposed and would like to participate here, I think that uh, we might have an interesting encounter of Celticists.
Thank
Yes,
you.
I was
So
wondering if you had any comments there from a specialist perspective on either the presentation, the video, the whole thing. I know that for me, as an outsider, the emergence of Gaulish polytheist revivalism has been an interesting thing to observe over the past several years. One of the more interesting tendencies in the contemporary community. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts.
sure. So yeah, thank you, Selgu iros, for this this presentation. I think as far as your general points are concerned, that not only applies to Gaulish polytheism as it can be understood and recovered from the sources, but also uh, most Celtic cultures, i.e., there's never just one version. And this search for the universals is one of these problems in Celtic studies in general. What Druid means in a continental Gaulish context is very different than what it means in a medieval Irish context, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely all of that, and I'm in full agreement with you on all of that. The one the one reservation that I would have is just in some of what you cited is the use of the varying different versions of the Byrne Scholia, because those, I mean, those were very likely, well, we can't say one way or another, but
they're also
given
really late too.
exactly.
they're late additions. So I was kind of hesitant to add them, but at the same time, like we probably should, just to like give the possibility of perhaps there's some texts that were lost during the Byrne Scholia's writing and we just don't have it, or maybe they were doing a, at the time, contemporary interpretatio as well, which I felt was also very appropriate. But
Yeah,
no, absolutely.
that is very likely, given that a lot of the monks at Bern that were from Irish extraction. The Irish were doing an awful lot of their own interpretatio, and it's very interesting that they did it, and that they felt comfortable and confident enough to do it kind of in this way that they do. But it's hard to say whether that actually applied to the original text or to Lucan's ideas. So yeah, that's one thing. And then I did have a little question about the video that you showed. It's wonderful. I enjoy it a lot. The commoner has a bit of a beer gut. And
so okay, I was working at a gas station at the time, and he was a regular of mine, and it's really hard to calc gas station regular. So we decided, well, regular person, and we were like, well, they probably didn't have that either. We'll get commoner works, fine. And he did have a bit of a gut. He was a nice guy, but I remember him, and that's what he was. That's what he was like. So,
yeah, there's and I mean, obviously nothing wrong with that. No body shaming or anything like that.
But absolutely not.
Given that we do have some of the information from elsewhere in the Posidonian ethnography that says that no one was tolerated in Gaulish society whose abdomen extended beyond their belt, so it's like, oh, here comes this guy, we know something bad's gonna happen to him. So
yeah, it didn't turn out well for him.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to keep those entrails somewhere, I guess. So,
It's a very interesting theophany. I think as these theophonic dreams and visionary experiences always are, drawing upon your knowledge of the tradition, but recombined in ways that show the living agency of the god as well. I found very interesting this concept of interpretatio indigena. And I think it reminds me of something that we were speaking about yesterday, where we were talking about how once you stop presupposing that syncretism reveals an underlying structure of sameness of the gods involved, you make it possible to recognize the agency both of the gods themselves who enter into a syncretistic alliance, but also of the people involved who demonstrate their agency in articulating their beliefs through these other systems, these other theological systems that they come into contact with. And I think to speak about interpretatio indigena, it returns that agency, as you said, to the Celts themselves, rather than acting as though it's simply an imposed syncretism. We see syncretism more as a moment in a dialogue between an indigenous culture and the Roman culture, which is being imposed in a colonial context. And yet, even in the midst of that colonial encounter, because we have two polytheistic civilizations involved, even within that power dynamic, because of the peculiarities of polytheistic traditions, I think there's a greater degree of dialogue and interchange in the process than we would see otherwise. And I think that that's the way in which we can make the kind of point that people often try to make, I think, in a heavy-handed and ultimately misleading way when they have recourse to interpretatio Romana, interpretatio Graeca. And so I was just wondering what your further thoughts are about that process of interpretatio indigena.
Well, I love the concept as well. It's done by Ralph Hustler, one of my favorite up and coming. Well, he's not up and coming, but one of my favorite authors. Moving on, and he really hit it home for me. I was at one point in time very anti-Roman as well. A lot of Gaulish polytheists do come in with that heavy-handed anti-Greek, Mediterranean, anti-Mediterranean type mindset. But you look at all the epigraphy, you look at like the writings and things like that, and there's clearly an exchange. You know, there's an example that I really love of a three-way cross-culture epigraphic example, and it's dedicated to Coccidius, and he's a god that has three technical total interpretatios, one to Solanus, one to Mars, and then he has a Celtic epithet attached to him, Wenostonos. These are all in different locations. And the one with Wenostonos is by a German, a self-described German, using a Latin context. So you have a German worshiping a Celtic god with Latin. And it's like, how can you argue at a certain point in time that this is being forced on people? You know, it just doesn't, you know, there were probably some reservations by a lot of the indigenous Celtic speakers, but, you know, the continental Celts in some places had reportedly a Hellenophilia, like the Galatians were Hellenized Celts, and Celtic speakers loved Iraklis. You know, he's just all over the place. Diodorus says that Iraklis is the father of the Celts or Gauls, depending on which version you go to. You know, as counter to Kaiser's Despater. Yeah, I don't think interpretatio is a bad thing, especially looking at it through the indigenous eyes. As long as they're the ones doing it, I think it's a valid practice.
Yeah, and I think as long as we don't see it also as imposing any kind of closure, you know, as you pointed out, there's no, it's an open-ended process, and it doesn't result in fixed identities. It results in a shifting field of alliances. And Stephanus, you'd like to chime in?
Right. So, and just not to plug my own work, but in discussing syncretism and interpretatio style syncretism, I think the thing that we so often get tripped up on, and scholars inevitably do because everything must be one, as we encountered yesterday, and as we encounter all the time, the Roman use of the verb to be, right? They don't actually have to even include it, you know, in the writing for it to be implied. And whenever we see is, we think equative rather than metaphorical. And so, you know, in a lot of these interpretatio style inscriptions, it may not be Mars is cocydious, it may actually be Mars, or rather, as is often the case, cocydious like Mars.
Exactly.
To turn the metaphor into a simile. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I mean, that you know, and there's no doubt that, you know, sometimes, you know, to use a trite phrase, for example, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb, right? That it's still March, right? It's not something else. So obviously, and Roman Mars can, you know, come in like a farmer and go out like a baller, you know. So it's all possible, and having that kind of multivalence of, you know, I mean, I always hesitate to use metaphor when we're talking about deities, because there is that metaphorical interpretation of deities that's so popular in archetypalism and all of that. But again, it's not the same thing to say that, you know, this deity is metaphorically this deity, you know, is not saying that all deities are metaphors. So yeah, I mean, as long as we understand that, and you're absolutely right that, you know, something that, are you familiar with Celticist called Morten Varmund? It's spelled Warmind. He's a Danish Celticist. He's one of my favorite Celticists. He's about 7 feet tall and built like a brick wall. He looks like, you know, the fullest version of like a scary 19th century Santa Claus you can imagine. Very jolly guy, and a brilliant Celticist. And he, I heard a paper he gave in 2003 where he said that, you know, what Julius Caesar is writing, of this kind of top-down elite interpretation is not the same as the everyday on the ground syncretism that you get in inscriptions. So yeah, I mean, we do have to keep those kind of things in mind as well with all of this as we look at it, because Caesar may have seen what he saw and interpreted it as he did with the resources he had available, but individual theophany that is oftentimes the root of actual inscriptions and so forth. I mean, that's something that way too many Celticists forget. You know, it's just a linguistic problem to them, as opposed to there's a religious reality here. And then the people who do recognize the religious reality want it to all be, you know, essentially, I mean, I also heard in 2019 at the Celtic Congress in Wales, a number of people literally using the terminology of the Celtic Church not to mean Columban Christianity of the 7th century, but this liturgical, basically Christian polytheism, which really isn't, that stretched across all of the Celtic lands. And, you know, everyone in the room, we all looked around at each other and kind of just went, why even bother taking further notes on this, because this is garbage. So anyway, even independent of anyone's own particular religious preferences. So yeah, I mean, this is just, you know, a continuous issue. But anyway, yeah, so thank you for presenting.
Thank you very much.
And one other issue that I'd like you to comment on a bit. All of these references to diverse forms of human sacrifice in these texts. How much weight do you give them as being reflective of actual practice as opposed to the Roman interest in othering people who they were attempting to forcibly integrate into the empire.
So one of my favorite authors is Jean-Louis Bruneau, and he's a French archaeologist. And he's the guy to go to in terms of the different sanctuaries and sites. People still quote him today. I have one of his books, the only book translated to English, but there's also a book in which he synthesizes the philosophy of the Druids. Like it's a synthesis, so obviously, there's going to be some conjecture, but he takes the timelines very well, makes some really good rationale. But what he argues in it is that the Druids, however you want to take them, as like a conglomerate or like specific regional Druids, whatever, they started to see that the Romans were on their way. And essentially, they were trying to counteract what they knew was going to happen and use human sacrifice as a reason to dominate their lands. So they started to move, again, according to Bruneau, they started to move towards animal sacrifice, and because according to Bruneau, they were practicing some form of human sacrifice, but the Druids were really like pushing against that. So some people were in favor of it, but the Druids were like, they're coming. We can't do this. We got to civilize ourselves a little bit more. Like, however, they want to, take us. We got to do away with this stuff. I don't doubt for a second that there was a form of human sacrifice. The context is up for debate. Some people say that there's evidence for mainly prisoners of war being sacrificed, criminals of any kind. I definitely don't doubt it. But again, context is important. And not only that, but there's also the idea of it might be a post-mortem sacrifice. So like when we talk about how, any type of human sacrifice is involved, we often think, well, they're alive at the time. It might not be the case. Maybe they're dead and they gave the body, towards that. So it's hard to tell on that. And the Lucan entry that I read, actually, Bruneau critiques, he's like, that could have came from a Roman auxiliary who just saw a bloody altar and didn't see like the actual victim of sacrifice. So, I mean, it could have been a chicken. It could have been a cow. It could have been a boar or anything like that. We don't know it's human. So he does a really good analysis in his Philosophers of the Barbarians, the Druid synthesis. So that's my thoughts on that.
Let me recognize Stephanus for a remark.
So one of the things that I think we got to keep in mind as well with the Romans and this issue in relation to the Gauls is that there's a lot of hypocrisy going on there, not only because we've got lots of evidence of Roman, definitely archaic Roman foundation sacrifice, but then also after the Gaulish sack of Rome, that there was a ritual that was done yearly that involved basically a human sacrifice where a Gaul was captured, buried up to their neck, and a bunch of stuff was done with them, and that wasn't considered human sacrifice because the Gauls weren't considered to be really human. So, that gets into many questions that we've been asking throughout this conference as well. So, yeah, I think there's no two words that freak out modern people about indigenous religions, ancient religions, etc., more than human sacrifice. And when I teach world religion classes and this question comes up, as it often does, I say, remember, the most familiar religion that practices human sacrifice, at least in symbolic form, every day, millions of times across the world now, is Catholicism. Because in that theology, it's necessary for Jesus to be fully human, more human than anyone ever has been, in addition to fully divine, in order to make the sacrifice worthwhile. So basically, what is the difference, especially if you believe in transubstantiation? So, don't act like it's outside of your own wheelhouse when you're doing it every damn day.
Yeah, and I mean this goes to the question also of the symbolic significance in these accounts of particular methods of human sacrifice that are appropriate to different gods. There's a good deal, it seems to me, just on a cursory glance, there's a good deal of symbolic significance to be derived from these accounts. And I would imagine that this is something that within your tradition, probably there's a certain amount of reflection on. Have you considered this? Because frequently when you have discourse about bodies, human bodies, frequently there's a mapping of the cosmos onto the human body. And these descriptions of methods of human sacrifice that are appropriate to different deities, if they're based upon not necessarily witnessed events, but accounts from native informants, it occurs to me that there could be a certain play of symbolism going on here that would be significant for elucidating the nature of the gods involved.
Yeah, I would say so. I personally haven't looked into them because those specific descriptions, there's like only one god that's in my my main custom, and that would be Tyrannos. And the others, Essos and Totatis. Essos is not someone I go out of my way for. Nothing against him, obviously. But Totatis is, it's really hard to pin down with him because more than likely it's a cryptonym. So it's probably a title to hide one's god from opposing forces. So we don't know if they're actually talking about a god that's named Totatis, or if it's another god and they just want to keep it a secret and they told someone and it's just been passed down over the time. But Tyrannos, for me, I haven't really thought about the implications of those. I do have a practice with Neolania in which I do create an effigy for her, which is actually coming up soon for my holiday Kiamanach, which is Winter Night. And she dwells with me for the entire winter season. And once spring hits for Gilmoritima, which is winter release, we are going to burn her and then send her down a local river to release spring. So there is a sort of sacrificial thing with that, but that's not a human sacrifice. That's more of a death of a god to bring about spring. So yeah, no, human sacrifice, I've played around with a mock human sacrifice as an idea, but I've never really like given too much thought with it. So
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I mean, there's also the human sacrifice in the theophany that
Mhm.
that you depicted in the video, which I think so we discussed a little bit at one point on Twitter when you first posted that video, and there I think that there's some interesting symbolism potentially with the release of the entrails and the red fallen leaves and the falling entrails of the commoner seem to create some kind of a parallel with the falling leaves and the obviously the waning year. It seems to me that there could be a language around these sacrifices that if we examine it closely, we might arrive at an interesting bit of doctrine, perhaps, in some of these descriptions that would get us past the kind of just the kind of ultimately boring, historical questions about whether this was practiced or not or how, because it's the discourse ultimately which is interesting. Stephanus notes there may be a cosmic dimension to it, land, sea, sky, correlating with the threefold death, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to compare these acts of human sacrifice, right? Both the way that they're discussed when it's a question of othering, right, and what they're trying to do cosmically and in relationship to the gods, to Amerindian sort of webs of predation or cannibalism, in which a similar kind of demonizing happened. But as Severus de Castro has been showing, the way cannibalism actually works is that instead of dehumanizing others, it's a question of seeing the human in everything. And so the reason that the other human is eaten is in order actually to incorporate this exterior humanness. And I think what you're saying about like periodicity and kind of mirroring of the cosmos is really important as well. In these religions and these traditions, there's an attempt to harmonize with the cosmos as the actions of gods, etc. And if predation, right, which is a part of any ecology, is part of the structure of the universe, then even warfare and stuff which can seem like distasteful would also actually be part of this activity of the gods.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to recognize the realities of life in all of these cultures, and in addition to the forms of othering that are going on in discourses about them as well. I mean, for instance, the point's often been made about conflict in indigenous societies, particularly in stateless societies, which often is on the aggregate resulting in very little actual loss of life or permanent injury. Then, of course, I mean, we have ritual settings, as you're speaking of, that often have it's often a different setting than the setting of conflict, and often has to do with the general orientation toward death and toward the reincorporation of the mortal being into the communal whole. There was a question which was somewhat I was wondering too. Oh, I see that you've answered it, Selgu iros. Yeah, about explaining a little bit more Bruno's argument. So Bruno's argument is that there was that they were engaged in a process of eliminating human sacrifice from the tradition. That this is the sort of historical moment that we see.
Yeah, so he goes over that the Druids essentially know and have contact of the Mediterranean, so the Greeks and the Romans and whatnot, and they're familiar with their civilization, some of their laws, philosophies, and things like that, and encountering their colonization attempts for what it is. Bruno points out that they try to move away from human sacrifice. So he argues that, yeah, they see them coming, so they quickly gather everything up and say, we got to change. So they have no fuel in their propaganda machine. So yeah, like we see Cicero and Caesar, saying that, yeah, they sacrifice humans, they're savages, and they try to group them monolithically, but the Druids kind of try to counteract that over time.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Yes, as Adam points out, yeah, if you'd like to make that point more fully, Adam, what you were saying about the role of such sacrifice in creating analogies between cosmic domains.
Well, Stephanus was calling it structuralism gone wild, and it made me think it could be also their own structuralism, right? In trying to analogize, in trying to create resonances between, to reference my presentation, the sky and the earth, or, we can differentiate those domains, as Stephanus said, into sky, earth, sea, right? And then they continually differentiate. And then the goal is, in this ritual practice, to make them sort of begin to interlock again at the same time and hold oneself affirmatively at the center of this whole system.
Yeah, and I mean, human sacrifice, with good reason, makes us very uncomfortable as moderns, and well, it should, because we're not part of a tradition where that is integral. And so we look at it, and I think that what people need to think about is the diverse array of things that people are prepared to give their lives for, and what people think of as the stakes of continued life, the stakes of death in different contexts, in different forms, different ways to die. And so I think that without removing any of the moral weight of human sacrifice, I think that the conversation that needs to happen around it is understanding, what are the stakes of life and death? What are the stakes of mortal being in a particular society? And what are people prepared to die for? I think that this is the kind of conversation that we need to have, just simply to understand what's even going on in such societies. Yes, and as Selgu iros mentions, we also have here the metaphor of the sky, of keeping the sky in place, and this demonstrates the utility of the kind of generic cosmological structure where we can talk in at least a basic or minimal fashion about the shared problem of keeping a certain space open, a space between sky and earth, keeping it open, which keeps living beings out of the underworld. And I think that this goes to the question of the stakes of life and death and the stakes of how one dies. The question of one's destination, the question of the nature, the different eschatological possibilities for the mortal, and also the significance that they have in a wider cosmological context for a given culture, for a given tradition. All right, now, since obviously, unfortunately, I don't know what happened, but clearly Olawole is not going to be able to join us. I think that my sense would be that we should end the panel early. If there's anyone who has further questions or contributions that they'd like to make, we haven't spoken very much specifically about Adam's paper, although of course I spoke at some length to kind of situate it. One thing I wanted to ask you, is this going to be published soon, so that people can read it? Yeah, in some finished form.
Yeah, I was planning to at least put it on my academia, but I was just talking to Justin. We might also throw it on the Oscillation site as well.
Yeah, because I think that it's the kind of thing that if people could engage with the text, had I thought of it, I would have perhaps posted the text in some fashion so that people could follow along with it. I know that when I give dense papers at conferences, I often would hand out copies to people back in the days before high-tech conferences like this. Is a question of a stack of Xeroxes, so that people could follow along and assimilate the material more in real time. But yeah, I think that if you could make that available, on whatever is a realistic time scale, I know the turnaround time is pretty fast at Oscillations, which would be the natural destination for it. I think it would be, I think it would be very helpful, and we could have a kind of ongoing discussion about it on some of the online platforms that we have available to us, because I think that we could bring a lot more people into the conversation, and I think really do some interesting work with it. So that being said, if anybody wanted to raise any further points or questions, then they could do so. But failing that, I'm thinking that we call the session early on account of having. Oh, I see. Stephanus has a further contribution, and the frequent formulae of "May the sky fall on me, the sea overwhelm me, the earth swallow me up," etc., in oath formulae. And in one of the Posidonian accounts of what the Celts said they feared, when Alexander hoped they would say they feared him, etc. Yes, and I mean these are examples. These are further examples of the kind of language of the closing of spaces through the imposition either of the sky falling or of a fluid medium overwhelming the open space, or the earth rising up. All of these have this kind of common element of the threat of the collapse of a kind of a space of encounter. And that's, I think, the kind of interesting theme to pursue. All right, so as I said, we will call it early if there are not further interventions, and we'll be reconvening at 7 p.m. Eastern time. You can do those calculations yourself with regard to your own time zones. We'll be reconvening for the final panel of papers at the conference. And I hope that I'll see all of you there and many more besides. Thank you all. Thank you everyone who participated, including the other attendees. And I'll see you later. Bye-bye.